Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
You might be inclined to think, with the backstop of a broadly improving economy and the charitable feeling that we have around the holidays, that our policy leadership could address and in fact achieve meaningful agreement on some broader human services issues. At least that's the hope. Welcome again to the most widely watched source for Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William. Happy holidays, and thank you for supporting this program for the last 23 years now. Wow. On this edition, Andy Brack of the South Carolina Statehouse Report and Kathy Almond from Stanly County's North Carolina Chamber of Commerce. And later, the Tar Heel State's Lieutenant Governor, Dan Forest.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded December 9th, 2013. On this week's program, Kathy Almond of the Stanly County Chamber of Commerce, Andy Brack from the Statehouse Report, and special guest, North Carolina Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest. Now, here's Chris William.
Happy holidays and welcome to the program. Kathy, good to have you here. I hope this is not too painful for you. I know this is your first time, but sometimes. And Andy, welcome back.
Thanks.
Andy, let's start with you. 2014 in the Palmetto State,
right.
Politically. What does that look like?
It looks like a reprise of what we did last year, which was a lot of talking and a lot of hot air and not much business. The legislature will focus on two restructuring things. Number one, it's going to again continue the conversation about significant ethics reform. It may actually get there this time. And then it's going to talk about the Department of Administration, trying to bring together the cabinet agencies and under one administrative body that replaces the old Budget and Control Board in an attempt to give the governor a little bit more control over the executive branch. That has the support of Governor Haley and Democratic Senator Vincent Shaheen, who is going to run against Governor Haley. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. There's a couple of other things that go on. There's going to be discussions about expanding Medicaid or not. There will be some talk about our roads, which we have $29 billion in needs in our roads, and the legislature has not stepped up to do anything majorly significant. And I think that we're going to have a good discussion on public education, specifically 4-year-old kindergarten. I think we're almost there universally in South Carolina, and I think this year that we'll get there and hopefully get all the children covered to give them a head start.
You know, Kathy, South Carolina, the Palmetto State does not have a corner on education challenges on some of these things. What rang a chord with you, what Andy just talked about? Any of those issues? Or all of those issues?
All of those issues, actually. I mean, education is very important, and not being able to grow the dollars that support the children, we've got to build that knowledge gap that we've got for upcoming workforce, and I think it's very difficult to face those challenges.
You know, let me go on just a little bit different tact, and it's around education. We were talking before the program. Cheryl Stanton is the new Secretary of the Department of Employment and Workforce. And Cheryl was on this program recently, and she's had the job about 8 months or so. And she said, and it was just surprising to all of us, it was one of those eyebrow-raising moments. She said when she first came in the job, she was surprised by the, and I quote, the lack of statewide unified strategy around education and workforce issues. And And why that was surprising is because all of us are talking about education, but why can't we seem to get on the same page about it? Kathy, we'll start with you. What is the issue in the Tar Heel state around this?
Well, I mean, and I think definitely in our area of the state, we've tried to focus more with like Central Line of Workforce Development on those workforce issues and working through the schools, but drilling it down to the lower levels is really important. Our school superintendent has worked very closely with our chamber, with some of our government officials to at least focus in our area, and I think that's something statewide that we need to do. We've got to look more and more at technical and vocational training as well as college and career training.
Yeah, Andy?
By the time this airs in South Carolina in a couple of weeks, I'm going to have a column that talks about education and workforce development because they're really the same thing. The difference is Democrats use the terms, let's increase public funding of education, to which the Republicans don't like. But Republicans talk about we have to improve workforce development. Well, that's education. I think what we're going to start seeing, at least in the public discussion in South Carolina, is that people who want more money for public education are going to start talking about it in terms of workforce development, because that's what high school education is. That's what technical college education is. I was at Florence Darlington Tech a few weeks ago and had a big conversation with the president there, and what he said to me was more and more technical colleges are going to be providing the first couple of years of training for bachelor's degrees, and then the kids will move on in their juniors and senior years to USC and Clemson and other four-year colleges. He thinks that's the model of where things are going. And similarly with technical education, more people are going to go get those first 2 years so that they can go work at the Boeings and the BMWs and the Continental Tires.
Well, okay, now here's the thing, Andy, because we've talked about this ad nauseum on this program, and I'm telling you over the last few years about this, and there has been some criticism from business saying the technical college system and the community college system in North Carolina, but specifically in South Carolina, businesses will say, wait a minute, Horry Georgetown Tech down on the coast is advertising to those folks that want to use it as a gateway to a four-year degree. When business and industry say, yeah, that's great, but what we need is we need workforce development, and you need to be piling limited resources into workforce development. So I'm going to give you a chance to answer that, but Kathy, how does this square against what you've heard and some of the things, some of the dialogues that you're having in Stanley County?
Well, I think the workforce development piece is still critical, and we're seeing more leadership development, more workforce development in the lower grades, as well as with the early college tied in with our community college. I think we're going to see more and more folks, just as Andy said, going in for that 2-year degree and then moving into the 4-year university.
So do we have too many people in this space talking about this instead of a unified strategy?
I don't know if there's a unified strategy on it. I think it's something that's starting to be figured out. But, you know, quite frankly, we have such a low rate of college graduates in South Carolina compared to other states in the union that anybody who goes into either a technical college or into a regular 4-year college is only a boon. I mean, the jobs, something like 60 to 65% of the jobs of the 21st century are going to require a technical college degree or something. And we just don't have that. We have 35% of the people that can do that in South Carolina. So, you know, to answer your questions, technical colleges are going to be taking on a bigger role, I think, in terms of training workforce for businesses and moving people through to the 4-year college system as well.
You know, one other hot issue out there is transportation and roads and funding. Kathy, DOT in North Carolina has changed their funding model that leans more toward the major markets when it comes to getting some of those projects that have been on the books and not done yet, done. And it's going to penalize, many people think, the smaller, more rural places of North Carolina. Is that a concern to you?
Of course it's a concern. Being in a rural county, it's a major issue. We already deal with transportation to and from. We have a lot of commuters that travel back and forth to Mecklenburg County and Cabarrus County for work, so transportation is always, of course, a major issue.
And in South Carolina,
oh Lord, it's a mess.
This is a fun one.
I mean, we have $29 billion of needs. That's billion with a B. Yeah. The legislature this year appropriated $500 million, way less, 2% of what it needed to do so they could go borrow money, and they borrowed about $2 billion to do road projects. But I mean, we have, I think, the lowest gas tax in the country at 7 cents a gallon. I mean, we are not investing in the infrastructure we need. And the South Carolina Trucking Association wants us to raise the gas tax because they say we need it.
So do you think Nikki Haley's going to relent?
No.
You don't think there's
No.
any chance she's going to give in and support
It's an election
that?
year. No.
Now, and again, we're probably going down this road, and we don't need to go too far down the road for time, but
Maybe to be paved.
Well, here's a point, Andy. Can the legislature get this done without governor support?
Probably not, unless they go on more of a borrowing binge. But they have a cap on how much they can borrow. We have some borrowing capacity in South Carolina, but not enough to build the roads, not enough to fix the hundreds of bridges that are decaying. I mean, we have significant infrastructure needs that we have to invest in, just like we got to invest in our children.
Yeah, that's going to have to be the last word on that. Folks, thank you. We're going to bring our guest on here just a second. Next week on this program, it's one of our favorite programs because it's one of our favorite series of programs because it is always interesting, because they are always engaging. And I'm talking about our four of counsel, if you will, economists. They come back every year at the same time and talk about where we were in the previous year and where we're headed in the next year. And we will do that again. And those economists are Dr. John Connaughton from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, Dr. Frank Hefner from the College of Charleston, of course, in Charleston, Dr. Doug Woodward from USC in Columbia, and Dr. John Sylvia, chief economist for the firm of Wells Fargo. He occupies the second highest elected office in the Old North State and is the only elected official, and this is important to know, is the only elected official to have both official powers in the executive and the legislative branches of government. While it is a fairly high-profile position and a heartbeat away from the governor's mansion, what is the role of lieutenant governor? And how does the politics of the current office holder affect policy? Joining us now is North Carolina Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest. Your Honor, welcome. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having me on today.
Now, you have heard the dialogue that we've had, Governor, and you're also have a front row seat here. Let's talk about this role of Lieutenant Governor. You are in a unique position where you know the DNA of the legislative dialogues that go on, but you also know the role and some of the DNA of what goes on in the executive branch. What is the role of Lieutenant Governor? And is there something you can do to act as a broker, not between the Republicans and the Democrats per se, but to kind of help grease the skids of what government can be doing better in North Carolina?
Sure. I think, like you mentioned, it's a very unique position, the only both executive and legislative position in the state of North Carolina. So on one hand, I have a foot in the executive branch and the workings of the executive branch, and very strong relationships with the secretaries and the agencies and the department heads as well, Council of State members, as well as the legislative branch as presiding over the Senate. So I'm there on a daily basis, watching what's going on the Senate floor, making sure everybody's playing fair and playing by the rules, and making sure we're adding political civility back into the equation. That's something that's very important to me. I think that's one of the greatest challenges we face in America today is political incivility. And so I think we have to, as politicians, we have to figure out how to cross over the aisles, how to make sure that even in the midst of heated debate and our differences, that we're still friends and that we can still do our job effectively.
You've got two things here, Governor, and I want to ask you about both of these. The Republicans have made some say draconian, but certainly historic changes in what's going on in North Carolina. Tax reform, the debate about health care, the Department of Commerce, and the list goes on and on. Some social issues. So how do you inject the civility in what has turned into, in some cases, some hard feelings between Republicans and Democrats? How do you bring that needle back to the center?
Oh, I don't think the needle's really been in the center for a long time, for many, many years. I think that incivility was there when the Democrats were in control, and they ran it for 140 years. And so there's probably some pent-up anger and pent-up anxiety about some of that. I think that if you're sitting in the midst of the debate on a daily basis like I do, you'd realize that the vast majority of the bills, some probably 98% of them, are very bipartisan. They pass in the Senate with numbers like 50-0 and 47-3, and that really is the vast majority of what's going on. And Some of those bills are introduced by Democrats and some are introduced by Republicans, but the vast majority of them have that bipartisan feel to them. And then there's always the handful that get people excited, they make good headlines, and they do make for some good arguments, and even some good arguments on the floor. But as president of the Senate, everybody gets a chance to speak. They get to speak as long as they want to speak, as long as the rules allow. They can come back and debate multiple times, so their voices are heard, regardless of who you are and what your seniority is or what your party is. And that's important to me to make sure that that happens.
Andy?
You know, Governor, I've been thinking a lot about education. And from South Carolina, where I sit, higher education is considered kind of a private good. If you have enough money, you can go to college. We have the highest public school tuitions in the South. But in North Carolina, after the administration of Terry Sanford, North Carolina embraced public education in higher education institutions as a common good to lift everybody up. And yet I look from South Carolina at what this legislature in North Carolina did this year, and it seemed to me that you just unloaded a quiver of nasty poisonous arrows at higher education, and you cut the higher education funding in North Carolina. I guess from South Carolina, I wonder, why do you want to become like us?
I'm not sure which arrows you're speaking of. If you give me some specifics.
I mean, you cut about $600 million or so of funding for higher education in North Carolina. I mean, that's not good.
Well, you know, we're still in the middle of a recession. We have a balanced budget. We have to balance the budget every single year. Balanced budget amendment. The Republicans took over a few years ago and had to find $2.5 billion worth of savings after the Democrats left. And so things had to get right-sized in order to be able to balance that budget. And I think everybody lives in hard times, whether you're in private economy or whether you're in the public sector. And I think the universities are in that same mode where, you know, they're in a growth mode for a long time, and now they're having to really rein it in. And I think that that's just something that happens in an economy like this. And turning the revenue stream around, getting jobs and the economy going in will change some of that. And I think there's a extremely high value on higher education. But the cost model has to be changed at that level too.
Can you remind me how much tax breaks you gave rich folks in North Carolina?
We gave tax breaks across the board to all folks in North Carolina. We cut the personal income tax in North Carolina to be competitive with the states around us in the Southeast. We cut the corporate income tax as well to be competitive. We eliminated the death tax, which allows people to keep their wealth in this state. And those are all good things. You know, we moved from 44th in the nation in business tax climate, Chris, as you know, to 17th in one move. And that brings business to North Carolina. That encourages people to come to North Carolina and create jobs and ramp up the economy and improve the revenue stream. And that means that more money ends up going to things like higher ed when that happens. You know, you mentioned education, and people talk about draconian cuts in North Carolina as it relates to K-12, but the reality is that's not true at all. There's more money being spent in this budget in K-12 education in North Carolina than has ever been spent in the history of North Carolina, by $320 million. So there's no cuts there.
Yeah, and Kathy, if you don't know this by now, you got to jump into this program.
Yeah,
or you're not going to get awarded.
I'm curious about the public-private partnership. How do you see that affecting economic development, especially in the rural counties of North Carolina? I know there's going to be some tier changes coming up this year, but where I sit is dead center between Tier 3 and Tier 1 counties. So how do you see the public-private partnership affecting the rural areas?
Well, one of the questions that I get all over the state, especially when I travel into rural communities, which is the majority of what I do, is people will say, what are you going to do for rural North Carolina? We're hurting out here. Don't forget us down east. Don't forget us out west. And that's a common theme. And what I always encourage people is that every single meeting I'm in, whether it's economic development meetings or whether it's education meetings, it doesn't matter what committee I'm on, the vast majority of the conversation is around rural communities and how do we help rural communities. And so that should be an encouragement to the people in rural communities. The public-private partnership was created to streamline the process of economic development in North Carolina. If you like the way things have been done, you know, over the past several decades, that has taken us to one of the highest unemployment rates in the nation. We can keep doing things the same way we've been doing it. But the reality is North Carolina was a difficult place to come in and seek work and for a company to set up shop and get running. And so the governor and his administration and the Department of Commerce and Sharon Decker said, we're going to change things around. We're going to take all these disparate parts like the rural center and the golden leaf and all these other pieces and parts and bring them all together so that it's a streamlined process and it's very simple for business to get going.
You know, you talk about the McCrory administration. One of the things that the McCrory administration has talked about over and over and over again, and obviously this could be bona fide, is if North Carolina could fix the Medicaid system, that there would be money for education and other things. How much money could really be freed up? And I don't expect you to hit it on the dime or anything like that, Lieutenant Governor, but how much real money could be freed up if we got Medicaid fixed? What does that do to the funding model in North Carolina?
Well, the discussion right now immediately is $1.5 billion. That's the overruns that have happened in North Carolina over the past couple of years. So we're looking at $1.5 billion. When the governor took over, it was every other day there was another $100 million showing up on the radar that they had to figure out how to pull out of the budget. There was a planned teacher raise in there of a small amount at one point in time, and that had to come out to go take care of Medicaid in North Carolina. So I think there's plenty of money in waste and abuse and fraud and the overruns that we see in there now that that money can go to other things. And I think we have to shore up education. We have to shore up teacher pay. I think these are things that we need to work on right away.
And when do you think this could be fixed, if it is to be fixed? In the near term?
They're working on it as fast as they can. I mean, the mess that was inherited there was quite significant, and they're making every step they can right now to improve that. And that hasn't been done. A lot of problems have been swept under the rug for a long time. And so I would hope that within the next year we will start to see the savings, significant savings.
We have about 3 minutes, Andy.
A lot of politicians talk about accomplishments. How about naming one thing that the Republicans did wrong in the last legislative session?
Well, I think, I've talked about this before. I think that we really do need to address teacher pay. I think that's an issue that should be front and center this time around. We didn't get to that because of the budget and some of the crises that came up in the budget. I think, again, related to education, I would say that removing the master's pay from teachers is another thing that I would hope that the legislature would revisit, look at that again. I think if people are seeking opportunity to improve themselves within their field, within their sphere of influence in education, that they should be rewarded for doing that. So those are two things. I think the biggest thing that we really got wrong was messaging. I think there are a lot of great things that happened in this legislature that the message never got out about, and the media took control of the message, and the Moral Monday activity took control of the message, and there's a lot of misinformation out there, so people haven't gotten the real story about the good things. A lot of good things have happened.
About a minute, Ken.
And I was going to say, unfortunately, though, I think some of the small business startups, they lost their tax cuts. That didn't get passed again this year, and they won't be able to utilize those. There's a lot of issues related to small business startups. I think just the ability for small businesses to get money and to be able to borrow money to start a business is one of the foundational efforts that we need to take on in North Carolina, the lending component of that. But the tax cuts across the board are going to put more money in people's pockets come January 1, and unfortunately health care is going to probably take most of that. A lot of that's going to go to pay for Obamacare and other issues. So, but more money will be in the pockets of North Carolinians and the pockets of families and the pockets of businesses so that they can hire and innovate and jumpstart the economy. And that is the way we believe it should be done.
Governor, thank you for being on the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Best of luck going forward as we watch you make the office of Lieutenant Governor a little bit more relevant than it's been in a long time. We hope you do that for the citizens, but it's good to have you on the program.
Thank you very much.
Kathy, thanks for being here. Andy, I want to make sure I get this in, the Center for a Better South. Yep. And the reason I'm saying this is because on this program, we believe in having a very broad dialogue about what is best for this region. Mm-hmm. The Center for a Better South, you handed me a book called the 2013 Briefing Book of the South. I'm going to Randy, you can get a shot of that. You got about 30 seconds. Tell me what the goal of this is to be.
The goal of the Center for a Better South is to provide thinking leaders with new ideas about things that can work in the South. We've done some tax policy stuff and some environmental stuff, and right now we're mostly working on an area called the Southern Crescent, and the website is southerncrescent.org. It stretches from Tidewater, Virginia, down the 95 corridor and across to Alabama and Louisiana. And it's an area that has a lot more poverty, a lot more problems. If we can work on solutions there, we bring the whole region up.
Yeah. Well said in a short period of time. I couldn't have done it better. Thank you, Andy, for being on the program. Thank you to you all. Happy holidays, and we hope that your holidays are truly merry and bright. Thank you for watching the program. Until next week, I'm Chris William, and have a good weekend. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.